Let me tell you about Zara Maxwell. Because honestly, someone needs to document this madness before the Galactic Military Academy tries to bury it in paperwork. Picture this. A 22-year-old human with the kind of confidence that makes seasoned veterans either laugh or reach for their emergency whiskey. She's got short auburn hair that she keeps regulation-perfect, brown eyes that sparkle with mischief, and a smile that says I know something you don't and you're not going to like it. Station Omega-7 houses the most prestigious military academy in known space, floating in the void between three-star systems like some kind of cosmic finishing school for future galactic peacekeepers. The place is a marvel of engineering and bureaucracy, which means it's simultaneously impressive and soul-crushingly tedious. Imagine a university campus designed by committee, then launched into space and filled with every conceivable alien species the galaxy has to offer. And boy does it have variety. You've got the Zephyrians with their blue skin and telepathic abilities, always looking slightly confused by human thoughts. There's the insectoid hive minds who travel in groups of 3 and finish each other's sentences. The crystalline resonants, who communicate through harmonic frequencies and sound like a space-age wind chime orchestra when they get excited. Then there are the humans, who everyone assumes are either the comic relief or the cannon fodder, depending on the day. Zara had earned quite the reputation in her 18 months at the academy. Not for being the best student, mind you, but for being the most creatively problematic. She had a talent for finding loopholes in regulations that weren't technically violations but drove instructors absolutely insane. Like the time she completed a stealth exercise by hiding in plain sight dressed as a maintenance worker, or when she passed her xenobiology exam by submitting a paper written entirely in limericks that were somehow still academically sound. The instructors had a love-hate relationship with her, emphasis on the hate. They couldn't fail her because she technically met every requirement, but they couldn't praise her because she made them look like idiots in the process. It was a delicate balance that Zara maintained with the precision of a Swiss chronometer and the subtlety of a freight train. Which brings us to Combat Tactics 301, taught by Commander Vextar, a 4-armed reptilian from the Drakmarian Empire who looked like someone had crossed a Komodo dragon with a particularly vindictive gym teacher. Vextar stood 7 feet tall, had scales that shifted from green to brown depending on his mood, and possessed the kind of arrogance that comes from being apex predator on 3 different worlds. He also had what humans would politely call opinions about the supposed inferiority of mammalian species. This particular morning, as students filed into the combat simulation chamber, you could practically taste the tension in the recycled air. Zara strolled in last, as was her custom, nodding to her fellow humans while completely ignoring the disapproving glares from various alien classmates who still hadn't forgiven her for last week's creative interpretation of formation flying. Commander Vextar stood at the center of the training mat, all 4 arms crossed in what could only be described as maximum intimidation posture. His scales had shifted to a deep brown, which anyone who'd been at the academy for more than 5 minutes knew meant he was in one of his educational moods. The kind where someone was about to learn a very painful lesson. Today, cadets, he announced, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and condescension that only career military instructors can perfect. We will be conducting a special exercise in hand-to-hand combat. No weapons, no technology, just raw physical capability. He paused for dramatic effect, his reptilian eyes scanning the assembled students like a predator selecting prey. I've noticed that some species in this class have developed what I can only call delusions of adequacy. It's time for a reality check. The alien students shifted uncomfortably. They'd heard this speech before, usually right before Vextar made someone's day considerably worse. The humans, meanwhile, exchanged glances that roughly translated to "here we go again." Combat pairs will be selected based on optimal learning outcomes, Vextar continued, which everyone knew was academy speak for "I'm going to make this as unfair as possible for maximum humiliation value." He began calling out names, carefully pairing smaller students against larger ones, weaker species against stronger ones, and in general demonstrating all the pedagogical sensitivity of a black hole. When he got to the humans, his scales actually seemed to darken another shade. Marcus Webb, you'll face Thorak. Thorak was a 8-foot-tall stone-skinned granite from the heavy gravity worlds, who looked like he could bench press a shuttlecraft. Marcus, bless his heart, was a perfectly average human who probably weighed about as much as one of Thorak's arms. Jenny Liu, you'll be paired with Sixandra. The mantis-like Sixandra had reflexes that operated on a completely different time scale than mammalian nervous systems. Jenny's chances of landing a hit were roughly equivalent to her chances of spontaneously developing psychic powers. Then Vextar's gaze settled on Zara, and his expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so obviously predatory. And Cadet Maxwell, you'll have the honor of facing Krog. a collective intake of breath from the assembled students. Krog was, to put it mildly, a unit. Standing 9 feet tall and covered in thick brown fur that looked like it could stop small-caliber rounds, he belonged to a species that the Academy handbook politely described as ursine analogous, and that everyone else called those terrifying bear things from the frontier worlds. Krog was actually a pretty decent guy once you got to know him, but in a combat situation, he was about as gentle as a landslide. Zara looked up at her assigned opponent, then back at Vexstar, then up at Krog again. The height difference was so dramatic it was almost comical. "Gee, Commander," she said with that trademark grin, "when you said optimal learning outcomes, I thought you meant we'd actually learn something. This looks more like a master class in physics, specifically the part about what happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force. Is there a problem, Cadet Maxwell?" Vexstar's voice carried the kind of fake concern that made everyone in earshot want to find somewhere else to be. "Oh, no problem at all," Zara replied, stretching her arms casually. "I just wanted to make sure we're all clear on the learning objectives here. Are we studying combat techniques, or are we conducting a practical demonstration of why the Academy has such comprehensive medical coverage?" A few of the other human cadets snickered, which only made Vexstar's scales darker. Around the training area, subtle betting had begun among the alien students. The odds were not in Zara's favor. Actually, calling them odds was generous. They were more like mathematical expressions of inevitability. "Your concern for Academy resources is noted, Cadet," Vexstar said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "However, I'm confident that this exercise will provide valuable insights into the relative capabilities of different species. Some of us, after all, have realistic expectations about our place in the galactic hierarchy." And there it was, the thing that had been simmering under the surface of every class, every exercise, every interaction. The unspoken assumption that humans were the junior partners in this galactic community, that they were here on sufferance rather than merit. Zara's grin widened, but something shifted in her eyes. "Well then, Commander, I guess we're about to find out just how realistic those expectations really are." The combat exercise began about as well as you'd expect when you pit a 5'6" human against what was essentially a walking carpet with anger management issues. Krog, to his credit, was trying to be gentle. The problem was that his idea of gentle was roughly equivalent to being hugged by a freight elevator. Zara's first attempt at a standard grappling move resulted in her bouncing off Krog's chest like a tennis ball off a brick wall. Her second attempt, a leg sweep that would have felled most humanoids, had about as much effect on the massive alien as a light breeze has on a mountain. By the third exchange, it was becoming clear that traditional combat techniques were about as useful as a chocolate teapot. "Fascinating," Vexstar announced to the class, his voice carrying that particular brand of academic smugness that made everyone want to throw things. "Notice how the human's inferior bone density and muscle mass make her completely ineffective against a properly evolved species. This is why humans require technological assistance for even basic survival in galactic society." The other students watched with varying degrees of discomfort as Zara continued to bounce around the mat like a ping-pong ball with delusions of grandeur. Some of the alien cadets were actually wincing in sympathy, which probably wasn't helping Vexstar's mood. But here's the thing about humans that the galaxy consistently underestimates: we're observers. We learn. We adapt. And we have absolutely no shame about cheating if the situation calls for it. Zara had been studying Krog's movements, and she'd noticed something interesting. For all his size and strength, the big guy was remarkably predictable. His attacks followed patterns, probably ingrained through years of formal combat training on his homeworld. He telegraphed his moves, relied on his natural advantages, and assumed that raw power would always triumph over technique. So when Krog wound up for what was clearly intended to be a finishing move, Zara did something unexpected. Instead of trying to block or dodge, she stepped directly into his attack, used his own momentum against him, and sent all 9 feet of furry alien tumbling across the mat in a move that would have made a judo master weep with pride. "What the hell was that?" someone in the class muttered. "I believe," Zara said, breathing hard but still grinning. "The technical term is physics. You know that thing they teach in basic science classes." Vexstar's scales had gone from brown to an alarming shade of purple. "Stop. Exercise terminated." "Already?" Zara asked, helping Krog to his feet. The big alien looked more confused than hurt, which was probably the best possible outcome. "But we were just getting to the interesting part. You were not following proper combat protocols, Cadet Maxwell. That was not a recognized fighting technique." "Really?" Zara's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Because it seemed pretty effective to me. I mean, Krog's the one on the ground, and I'm the one still standing. Isn't that how these things are usually scored?" The other students were starting to murmur among themselves. A few of the humans were actually smiling, which was probably making Vexstar's day even worse. You were using unorthodox methods, the commander snapped. In real combat situations, such tactics would be considered dishonorable. Unorthodox. Zara's voice carried just enough incredulity to make it clear she thought this was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard. Commander, with all due respect, if someone's trying to kill me, I'm not particularly concerned about their opinion of my fighting style. Dead people rarely file complaints about honor violations. That did it. Vextar's scales went from purple to a color that probably didn't have a name in most languages, and before anyone could react, one of his forearms whipped out and caught Zara across the face with a slap that echoed through the training chamber like a gunshot. The entire room went dead silent. Zara stumbled backward, her hand going to her cheek where a red mark was already forming. For a moment, everyone just stared, alien and human alike, waiting to see what would happen next. Zara straightened up, worked her jaw experimentally, and then looked directly at Vextar with an expression that was somehow both amused and absolutely terrifying. "Well," she said, her voice perfectly calm, "I guess we're done with the theoretical portion of today's lesson. Now, here's where things get interesting, because what happened next is the kind of thing that gets talked about in Academy legends for decades afterward." Vextar, apparently thinking that one slap hadn't been enough to make his point, advanced on Zara with all four arms flexing in what can only be described as full intimidation mode. "Perhaps now you understand your place in the natural order, human," he snarled, looming over her like a very angry, very large gecko with authority issues. Zara rubbed her cheek thoughtfully, as if she were considering his words with the seriousness they deserved. Then she tilted her head and said, "You know what, Commander, you're absolutely right, I do understand my place now." Vextar's expression shifted to something that might have been satisfaction if it weren't so obviously premature. "My place," Zara continued, "is standing over the unconscious body of anyone stupid enough to put their hands on me without permission." What followed was less a fight and more a master class in applied human stubbornness with a minor in creative violence. Vextar's first mistake was assuming that his extra arms gave him an advantage. His second mistake was not realizing that extra limbs just meant more things for Zara to grab, twist and use against him. The commander swung with his upper right arm, a move that should have sent any normal opponent flying. Zara ducked under it, caught his wrist as it passed overhead, and used his own momentum to spin him halfway around while simultaneously kicking out his knee. Now Vextar was a trained military instructor, so he compensated with his other three arms, reaching for her with what probably looked like a very intimidating display of reptilian multitasking. Which was exactly what Zara had been counting on. She grabbed his lower left arm, stepped into his guard, and executed a move that looked like it came from 3 different martial arts traditions and possibly a bar fight or two. Suddenly, Commander Vextar found himself in the deeply uncomfortable position of having his own arms tangled together in a configuration that definitely wasn't covered in any military manual. "The thing about having 4 arms," Zara said conversationally while maintaining what could only be described as a very creative joint lock, "is that if you don't coordinate them properly, they get in each other's way." Vextar tried to break free, which only made things worse. Every time he pulled with one arm, another one got twisted further into the human pretzel Zara was creating. His scales were now cycling through colors that probably didn't exist in nature, and the sounds he was making suggested that his vocabulary had expanded beyond standard military terminology. "Of course," Zara continued, as if she were delivering a lecture on xenobiology, "the real problem with intimidation tactics is that they only work if your opponent is actually intimidated." She shifted her grip, and suddenly Vextar was airborne, all 4 arms flailing uselessly, as he described a perfect arc through the training chamber's artificial atmosphere. The laws of physics took over from there, and 900 pounds of angry reptilian instructor met the training mat with a sound like a sack of wet cement hitting concrete. The classroom was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop in the vacuum of space. Vextar lay there, not moving, his arms arranged in what could charitably be called a non-standard configuration. His scales had settled into a pale green that suggested he was either unconscious or had achieved some kind of reptilian enlightenment. Zara stood over him, barely breathing hard, and dusted off her academy uniform with the kind of casual precision that suggested this was just another day at the office. She looked around the classroom at the stunned faces of her fellow cadets, alien and human alike. "Now that," she said with perfect timing, "is what we call a practical demonstration of adaptive combat techniques." Questions. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, Krog's deep voice rumbled, "That was most educational." And that's when the dam broke. Half the class erupted in nervous laughter, the other half just stared in complete shock, and somewhere in the middle, a few of the human cadets started what might have been a slow clap if the academy hadn't immediately been plunged into chaos by the arrival of campus security. The next few minutes played out like a scene from the galaxy's most bizarre documentary. 3 security officers burst through the training chamber doors, expecting to find the usual academy drama, maybe a sparring match gone wrong, or possibly someone having an allergic reaction to the recycled air. What they found instead was Commander Vextar lying unconscious on the training mat in what appeared to be a very artistic interpretation of a pretzel, surrounded by a classroom full of cadets who looked like they'd just witnessed either a miracle or the end of the world. The lead security officer, a pragmatic centurion named Officer Blacks, took one look at the scene and immediately reached for his emergency medical scanner. Not because he was particularly concerned about Vextar's well-being, mind you, but because unconscious instructors generated the kind of paperwork that could ruin an otherwise pleasant duty shift. What happened here? Blacks asked, his four eyes scanning the room with the kind of professional wariness that comes from years of dealing with academy incidents. The classroom erupted in a chorus of voices, each cadet apparently eager to provide their own version of events. The Zephyrians were trying to explain through telepathic projection, the hive minds were harmonizing their account in three-part harmony, and the human cadets were talking over each other with the kind of enthusiastic chaos that only comes from witnessing something truly spectacular. Silence. Blacks's voice cut through the cacophony like a sonic blade. The room fell quiet, except for the faint humming of the life support systems and what might have been Vextar snoring. One person, chronological order, actual facts only. All eyes turned to Zara, who was still standing over the unconscious instructor with the kind of casual confidence that suggested this was all perfectly normal. She shrugged and said, "Commander Vextar assigned me to spar with Krog. When I used unconventional tactics to gain an advantage, he called the exercise and slapped me across the face. I responded by demonstrating that forearms don't necessarily make you a better fighter." Officer Blacks's expression suggested he was reconsidering his career choices. "You're telling me that you, a human cadet, defeated a senior Drakmarian instructor in hand-to-hand combat?" "Defeated is such a strong word," Zara replied thoughtfully. "I prefer to think of it as providing him with an unscheduled nap opportunity." The security team exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared desire to be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading through the Academy's communication networks with the speed and accuracy of gossip, which is to say very fast and completely wrong in all the most entertaining ways. By the time the medical team arrived to check on Vextar, the story had already mutated into at least 6 different versions. In one telling, Zara had single-handedly defeated the entire Drakmarian military. In another, she'd discovered a new form of martial arts that violated several laws of physics. The most popular version claimed that she'd actually been a secret agent all along, which explained everything and nothing simultaneously. The truth, as medical scans confirmed, was both simpler and more complicated. Vextar was physically fine, just unconscious from what the Academy's chief medical officer diplomatically described as sudden kinetic readjustment syndrome. His pride, however, had suffered injuries that would take considerably longer to heal. As news of the incident spread beyond the Academy walls, reactions varied widely depending on species and political affiliation. The Drakmarian embassy issued a formal complaint about the treatment of their military liaison. The human colonial authorities sent a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in their citizens' ability to defend themselves when necessary. The Galactic Peace Corps suggested that this was an excellent opportunity for cross-species sensitivity training. But the real impact was happening on a much more personal level, right there in the Academy corridors. Human cadets who had been walking around with their heads down for months suddenly found themselves standing a little straighter. Alien students who had never given their human classmates a second thought were now looking at them with something that might have been respect, or at least healthy caution. The betting pools that had started during the combat exercise had evolved into something resembling a futures market for human potential. Some of the more entrepreneurial cadets were already taking advance orders for sparring sessions with the legendary Zara Maxwell, though she had politely declined all requests with her trademark grin and a suggestion that they might want to stick to simulation exercises. The Academy's social dynamics shifted overnight. Suddenly, humans weren't automatically assigned to the back of group projects. They weren't automatically assumed to be the weak link in team exercises. Some instructors even started calling on human cadets for answers, which was such a radical departure from normal protocol that it caused its own minor scandals. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with this development. There were grumbles from some of the more traditional alien factions about humans getting ideas above their station. A few instructors made pointed comments about the importance of respect for authority and proper military hierarchy. But these complaints had a distinctly hollow ring to them, probably because everyone kept glancing nervously at the training chamber where the incident had occurred. 3 days later, Zara found herself sitting in the Academy Board's hearing chamber, which was basically a conference room designed by someone who thought intimidation was an interior design philosophy. The walls were covered in holographic displays showing the flags and insignia of every member species of the Galactic Alliance, and the ceiling projected a slowly rotating view of deep space that was supposed to remind everyone of the vast scope of their responsibilities. Mostly, it just made people dizzy. The board itself consisted of 7 members representing the major galactic powers, each one looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else dealing with literally any other problem. Admiral Korthak, the Zephyrian chairwoman, had the expression of someone who'd been asked to referee a sporting event where she didn't understand the rules, the players, or why anyone thought this was a good idea in the first place. Cadet Maxwell, Admiral Korthak began, consulting a datapad that was probably thicker than most textbooks. You stand accused of assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming a cadet, and what our legal department has classified as creative interpretation of Academy regulations. How do you plead? Zara had spent the last 3 days in temporary quarters, which gave her plenty of time to think about her response. She could have gone with contrition, thrown herself on the mercy of the board, and probably walked away with nothing worse than extra duty assignments and a stern lecture about respecting authority. Instead, she did what she always did. She went with honesty, sarcasm, and just enough defiance to make things interesting. Well, Admiral, that depends on how we're defining assault. If defending myself when a superior officer struck me across the face counts as assault, then I guess I'm guilty as charged. If, on the other hand, we're using the standard legal definition that requires me to be the aggressor, then I'd say the evidence speaks for itself. The board members exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand why this case had landed on their desks instead of being handled through normal disciplinary channels. Admiral Korthak's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement if Zephyrians were capable of finding anything about military bureaucracy funny. The board has reviewed the security footage from the training chamber, she continued, as well as testimony from the 37 cadets who witnessed the incident. We've also received what can only be described as an unprecedented volume of character references on your behalf, Cadet Maxwell. Apparently, word of your actions has spread beyond the Academy. That was something of an understatement. In the 3 days since the incident, Zara had received messages of support from human colonies across the galaxy, several offers of employment from private military contractors, and at least one marriage proposal from someone who claimed to be a Centaurian prince but was probably just a very enthusiastic fan of interspecies relations. More significantly, the board had been inundated with formal complaints about Commander Vexter's conduct. It turned out that his tendency to make species-based generalizations and his creative interpretation of appropriate instructor-student boundaries had been bothering people for quite some time. The Academy's legal department had discovered a paper trail of incident reports, formal grievances, and carefully worded diplomatic protests that stretched back months. The board finds, Admiral Korthak announced, that while your methods were unorthodox and your attitude toward authority figures could use some adjustment, your actions fell within the legal definition of self-defense. Commander Vexter's conduct, on the other hand, violated several Academy regulations, 2 interspecies treaties, and what our cultural liaison describes as basic standards of civilized behavior. The relief that washed over Zara was almost physical. She'd been preparing herself for expulsion, court-martial, or possibly being shipped back to Earth with a notation in her file that would make her unemployable anywhere in the galaxy. Instead, she was getting what amounted to a slap on the wrist and an official vindication. However, the Admiral continued, and Zara's heart sank because there's always a however in these situations. The board is concerned about the precedent this incident might set. We cannot have cadets believing that physical confrontation is an appropriate response to disagreements with instructors, regardless of the circumstances. Therefore, you will be assigned to remedial classes in conflict resolution and diplomatic protocol. You will also serve as a peer counselor for incoming human cadets, helping them adjust to Academy life and understand the importance of cross-species cooperation. Zara blinked, processing this information. So, let me make sure I understand this correctly. My punishment for defending myself against an abusive instructor is that I get to help other humans avoid similar situations. That is correct, Cadet Maxwell, and Commander Vexter has been reassigned to a position more suited to his particular talents. Specifically, he will be conducting equipment inspections at a supply depot in the Outer Rim, where his interactions with sentient beings will be limited to quarterly efficiency reports. 2 weeks later, Zara was back in combat tactics class, now taught by Lieutenant Commander Yazeth, a soft-spoken crystalline who treated all species with equal respect and had the novel idea that learning should involve actual learning rather than ritualized humiliation. The class dynamic had changed completely. Alien and human cadets actually worked together now, sharing techniques and insights, instead of maintaining the careful segregation that had characterized the Academy's social structure for decades. The legend of the incident had settled into Academy folklore, with Zara as the reluctant hero who'd stood up to institutional prejudice and won. She handled the attention with her characteristic mix of humor and humility, deflecting praise while quietly mentoring younger cadets who found themselves struggling with the academy's complex social dynamics. During one particularly routine training session, a new cadet approached her with the kind of nervous excitement that suggested he'd been working up the courage for this conversation for weeks. "Cadet Maxwell," he said, practically vibrating with anticipation, "is it true that you single-handedly defeated a four-armed instructor in hand-to-hand combat?" Zara looked up from the equipment she'd been checking, considered her response carefully, and then grinned that trademark grin that had gotten her into so much trouble over the years. "Kid," she said, "the thing about legends is that they're usually about 10% fact and 90% storytelling. What actually happened was that I got lucky, stayed calm under pressure, and remembered that the best way to win a fight is to make sure your opponent defeats themselves." She paused, then added with perfect timing, "Of course it doesn't hurt if they're arrogant enough to give you plenty of opportunities to work with." The cadet's expression suggested this was not the answer he'd been expecting, but it was probably the one he needed to hear. As he walked away, undoubtedly planning to share this wisdom with his fellow newcomers, Zara returned to her equipment check with the satisfaction of someone who'd managed to turn a moment of violence into a teaching opportunity. The Academy continued its mission of training the galaxy's future peacekeepers, but with a subtle shift in perspective. The assumption that some species were naturally superior to others had been replaced by a more nuanced understanding that every culture brought unique strengths to the table. Humans were no longer automatically relegated to support roles, and other species were no longer assumed to be inherently better suited for command positions. And somewhere in the Academy's vast database of incident reports, filed under educational opportunities rather than disciplinary actions, was the official record of the day a human cadet reminded the galaxy that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn, one interaction at a time. As for Zara Maxwell, she graduated 18 months later with honors, commissioned as a lieutenant in the Galactic Peace Corps, and went on to have what the official records describe as a distinguished career in diplomatic security. The unofficial records suggest she continued to find creative solutions to complex problems, usually involving a combination of tactical brilliance, strategic patience, and just enough controlled chaos to keep everyone on their toes. But that, as they say, is another story entirely.